In this tutorial, we're going to talk about using something that can be very helpful for watercolor artists, and that is art masking fluid. This is going to be a short tutorial. I'm going to show you why you would use this and why it's a good tool to have in your toolkit. So masking fluid is really helpful. You are creating a watercolor painting that perhaps has more intricate details. And what masking fluid does is it's basically, I don't want to say plastic, but it is kind of like plasticky gum material that you paint over the paper to protect what's underneath. So when you peel it back, you'll just have your blank paper underneath. I have used masking fluid. I don't use it a lot in my watercolor practice, but I have used it for lettering projects. I actually have a YouTube video for that specifically if you're looking to use it for lettering, but I also use it on my more intricate paintings where I'm a little bit nervous that I might get paint where I don't want it to go. In those cases, I will use art masking fluid. So let's get started here. We're gonna do something really simple. We're gonna start off with something really simple, and you don't have to follow along with me. I'm just showing you how the masking fluid works. But in order to do that, I am going to draw just a little flower. And I want this flower to be blue, but I want this background to be an orange color. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover this with masking fluid so it makes it really easy for me to paint the background on this. The masking fluid I'm using, and I've also added a link to this YouTube tutorial, is Winsor & Newton, but there are other ones, but this one is pretty good. Okay, as you can see, some of this has dried and it's almost like a rubber. I think that's a better example than plastic. It's very rubbery. This is it dried, you don't need that. And what I like to do is I just pour a little into my lid, but just keep in mind when you do that, sometimes your lid gets really sticky. So I actually recommend pouring it onto something else, but I wouldn't put it on my palette just because I don't want to mess up my paints, but maybe like a little piece of paper. You don't need that much of it. And before we start to put this on our paper, I want to caution you, do not use brushes that you care about because the masking fluid will ruin your brushes. I have an old brush that I use for it, and then I also have a silicone brush. The link for the silicone brush is in the notes under this tutorial as well. But a silicone brush can be really good because it's easy to just pull the masking fluid off of it when you're done or rinse it. But brushes, if you use your brush and you want to keep it nice, you really got to wash it right after, and you kind of have to scrape it. But because of the scraping, you kind of ruin the tips of your brushes. So like I said, don't use a brush you care about. This one I don't care about. And all I'm doing is just using the pure masking fluid. And I'm going to paint with my masking fluid over my little flower here. This is protecting this flower from any of the paint that I'm going to paint over it. This masking fluid is really good sometimes if you might have like a teeny tiny center of a flower that you want to make sure stays nice and crisp and clean. You can just cover it in masking fluid until you're at the very end of your painting. Some other times I've used it is if I'm doing a big landscape scene and something has tiny details. House paintings, the window frames, a lot of times I'll use masking fluid, which can be really helpful. Okay, so what just happened there is it's starting to dry, so it started to pull up. So you gotta be kind of quick and make sure that you have covered it all, and then you need to let this dry. Don't start painting until it dries. Now that this has completely dried, the way you're gonna check it is just lightly tap your finger, and you should not pull up anything. You should not see your fingerprint in this. That's when you know it's pretty dry. When it dries, it's still kind of sticky, so just keep that in mind. Now what you can do is, and let me just caution you one more time, you want to make sure this is dry, because if you bring your good brush through it, it's going to get on your brush and then it's going to mess up your brush. Okay, I'm gonna do orange. I'm just grabbing some color here to just demonstrate to you what we're gonna do. So I'm making this nice and saturated. And what I can do is just literally paint over it. And because this is a rubber texture, the watercolor and paint just kind of bead up on the rubber texture, and they keep our paper underneath safe. This is a great way if you're doing a background and maybe you have a little bird in the sky and you're really nervous about painting around that bird, then you could use masking fluid on it. Or like I said, window panes. If you're painting a house, you can use masking fluid for those window panes. Okay, this isn't the prettiest example, but it's just showing you guys this technique. I need to let the watercolor paint dry. I know there's lots of drying in this. Once this watercolor paint is dry, then we can come in and we can remove our masking fluid, but we can't do that until this watercolor paint is dry behind it. And make sure that you just really get into all of the little areas. Make sure they're nice and covered. So I will meet you back here again when this is dry. Now we are back to our painting, and our watercolor paper, the background has dried. I just taped my paper down so it's a little bit warped, but usually I work on a watercolor block and I suggest you do that too. And you have to be careful here. You don't want to just start, when you do this with your hand, a couple things are going to happen. You're going to start tearing up the texture of the paper underneath, and then whatever oils are on your hand are going to get on your watercolor paper, and you don't want that. I'm being very particular here, but I just want to show you the right way to do this. So I grab a little bit of saran wrap and I wrap it around my finger, and I just lightly start to pull it up. And then once you pull it up, you can kind of grab it like that. But you can just lightly do this and it'll take off all that masking fluid. Make sure you're done with your background before you do this because the whole point would be wasted. And now I have my beautiful paper back here, and I can come in with whatever color I want and I can paint, and I don't have to worry about the orange background being on this piece of this area of paper, because it's nice and crisp and clean because it was protected by our masking fluid. So that is how you use masking fluid. And just a quick recap. The first one is it's basically rubber that covers the paper and protects whatever is underneath it. Once it's dry, you can paint over it. You never, ever, ever want to use your good brushes with masking fluid because it'll ruin them. So make sure to use an old brush that you don't care about, or get silicone brushes. Secondly, make sure, again, it's completely dry before you paint over it. And then when you remove it, make sure the background that you painted over it is completely dry. So your paper, everything's dry. And I like to use a little piece of saran wrap just around my finger to pull up the masking fluid. I hope that this tutorial was helpful, and I hope you enjoy using masking fluid in your paintings.